Hello there, John Kuturillo here, the counsellor of your listener. Thank you for joining us for this episode. As usual, thanks to everybody who makes this work possible. And also, as usual, if you have concerns about yourself or somebody else, please never take what you find on the internet or in the media as advice. Please seek advice from a professional or somebody else that you trust. If you are in Australia and are seeking counselling from me, you can find my contact details in the description of this episode. Today, it's my pleasure to welcome Tony Martinez all the way from the United States. Tony, thank you so much for joining me today. It's a pleasure to have you.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm looking forward to this.
Tony, today we're going to have a fascinating discussion, but before we do, tell us about yourself and what you do.
So my name is Tony Martinez, and I'm joining you guys all the way from the sunshine state of Florida here in the United States. And I co-host a podcast with my wife called Unshaken. And it is part of Unshaken Ministries, and where we try to have honest conversations about faith, resilience, and living life when life doesn't go the way that we planned, to be able to stay resilient and stay rooted, when life doesn't always go the way that we think it will.
Wonderful. And links to Tony's work at Unshaken Ministries will be in the description of this episode for anybody who wants to find them. Now, in today's episode, consistent with Tony's theme of his work, we're going to be discussing how one can have a solid marriage and a solid relationship with somebody else when there are challenges involved, such as one person being a disability carer for the other. And this was particularly inspirational to me when I heard of Tony's testimony online, because I was actually having a discussion with someone recently, and one of the topics we discussed was how sometimes we can take a lot for granted in life, and we can often do things based on assumptions, but without conscientiously thinking about the details. And one of the details that I would be willing to predict many people don't ask when entering a relationship is what would happen if one of us were to become incapacitated and one of us had to care for the other. Would we still have the same strength of bond and the same passion? Now, I know it's slightly different for you, Tony, because you married your wife having already had your disability from birth, but it's a similar principle of, would we still love someone notwithstanding the challenges that are involved in the relationship that we really can't change? And so I'm always fascinated to hear what makes people resilient and what makes people inspired to keep going through the challenges. So, Tony, wherever you'd like to start, we're really keen to hear your story and what you have to say on this subject.
So it's a really interesting thing because I have known my wife for a very long time. We were family friends for quite a while before we actually started dating. We had worked together at various places and hanging around each other. My disability never really was at the forefront. Obviously she knew I was disabled, but it just wasn't a big deal to us. And then when we actually decided to date, we went out on our first date and we went to a pizza shop. And as I was getting out of the car, I actually fell. The pavement was loose, the gravel was loose, and I fell. And at that point, my wife, who I was dating at the time, didn't know what to do. She didn't know, should she help me? Should she not help me? Should she ask me if I needed help? She just didn't know what to do at that point. And so, and of course, me, I'm mortified. I'm embarrassed beyond belief because here I am on this first date with her, and trying to make a good impression, trying to be the cool guy, and here I am, face first on the pavement, because I just slipped on some gravel. We kind of worked through that, and really that set the stage for how our relationship was going to kind of evolve, because what ended up happening on that first date is we had a conversation and we talked about what that would look like kind of going forward. So as we were dating and as we kind of moved through the dating process and we got engaged after a while and And as we've moved into the marriage, what has kind of marked our marriage is the fact that we've had many conversations, like you said, John, that people take for granted, that people never think about, but we had to think about it because of the uniqueness of my disability and how it's going to affect our marriage. I was born with cerebral palsy, which mostly affects my legs. I do walk, but I do walk with a crutch. My balance is not, what is typical for most men. So I do fall quite often, and so now we've learned that when I fall, her job is to keep people from rushing in to try to help me up before I'm ready to get up. Because if I'm not sure that I can hold my own weight and people are trying to pick me up, I'm going to go right back down to the ground because I'm not sure that I can hold my own weight up again. So one of the things that we've just learned is we've learned to have sort of awkward conversations, but we've learned to kind of laugh through them. And because of that, I think that's one of the reasons why our marriage is so strong, because we know that we can talk to each other. We know we trust each other, and we've walked through a lot of conversations that just simply so many take for granted.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Tony. That's a fascinating story, and there's a lot that we can learn from that. That, as you said, many of us don't think about until the time comes. One of them is that even though certain conversations might be awkward or certain situations might be awkward or embarrassing, what makes us stronger in the long term is when we face them and are willing to say, well, we can't change that this has happened, but there are things we can do about it in the present. And it shows a real strength of bond between two people when they can say, this is a conversation that no one wants to have, but once we have it, we'll be all the better for it, because at least we'll be prepared for things that may happen, or we'll be prepared for inevitable events. What it also teaches us is that the experiences that we've had can completely change the way that we see the world, and sometimes it can be really difficult to change the way we perceive the world unless we've had certain experiences, and sometimes that's why it can be such a shock to people's system when they experience any type of life change, whether it be within themselves or whether it be in their relationship with somebody else. Given that your disability was always present, but it was never at the forefront, it demonstrates that there was a real strength of bond between you and your wife, because both of you were looking far beyond the superficial aspects of the situation into the spiritual and the metaphysical and the components that make a relationship wholesome and that ultimately make life wholesome, those deeper elements of connection that can't be felt physically and that can't be measured effectively. Something else that strikes me is that despite the fact that situations like that one must have been quite embarrassing and mortifying, neither of you gave up and neither of you said, oh, this is just too much. You thought, well, sure, this is not pleasant, but we can do something. We can make this work. We can push through it. And even if it's not pleasant at times, pushing through the awkward times is completely worth it, because at the end of it will be that strength of relationship and that solid spiritual connection that we couldn't have any other way unless we push through those difficult times.
Yeah, for us, prayer is a big component for us. We pray together daily, and that really has not only has it shaped our marriage, but it also kind of changed our marriage as well. When we made the conscious choice to pray together as Christians, we just decided that, you know what, prayer is going to be a foundation for us in our marriage, and we said, you know what, we are going to pray above all else, and we're going to pray together, and we're going to pray, for each other, with each other, and even though, in the beginning that might feel awkward or seem awkward in the beginning, I truly believe that because we have made a commitment to pray together, that our bond is even stronger because of that prayer. Because when you pray together and when you let go of the performative stuff that always happens when you first start praying together, and you truly just get down to the things that you're worried about, that you're stressed about, that you truly want to have happen, when your partner hears those things, they now know what is burdensome on your heart, and they're able to pray for those things for you and know, okay, this is what Tony is fearing. This is what he fears. This is what he is really wanting. This is what he's, kind of stressed about. This is what he's worried about. And so my wife is able to pray for those things when I'm not around and when I'm not with her. So she's able to pray for me on her own and know specifically what is important to pray about. And I think those things are true strengths for us when it comes to, the bond that we have and being able to love each other well. The Unshaken podcast that we do was kind of born out of those awkward conversations, because we knew that so many people think that they're the only ones going through this, and especially when you're dealing with a disability, you feel like you're the only one that has it, or you're the only one that is experiencing it this way. And so we knew if we could have those conversations on a podcast and kind of put those experiences out there, that we could give word and we could give conversation to someone that knew they needed to have the conversation, but didn't have the words for it. But when they hear somebody else, they're like, yes, that's what I mean. That's what I've been trying to say for, in some cases, years, but they just didn't have the words for it. And so I think all of those, when you have those shared experiences, I think it's just so really powerful to be able to bring in that community and be able to say, you know what, you're not the only ones that are going through this. We've also gone through this, and we want to walk with you through that experience to try to help as much as we can.
That's a beautiful sentiment. It sounds like the experiences that you had have really inspired you to want to share your wisdom with other people so that they can benefit from it as well. And I'm interested to hear more about the role of faith in your life, starting from as far back as you've been a Christian, because something that I'm always discussing with my audience are some aspects of psychology that are very strongly related to the psychology of religion. And this is something that I've started discussing more explicitly of late. And I'm interested to hear what role that faith has played in your own life throughout your lifespan, but also in your wife's life as well, because I think this is an important learning opportunity of just what type of virtue faith can have for people and just how important it can be.
Yeah, for me, faith was something that I didn't find until I was halfway through high school. As I grew up a really angry kid because I didn't understand why I had a disability. I thought that that I was a mistake. I thought I was an accident. I thought I was made of spare parts. I really didn't understand why I was here and why this happened to me versus the kid down the street. And so I was angry at my parents. I was angry at the world. I was angry at God. If you looked at me the wrong way growing up, I cursed you out and I didn't care. And, for much of my childhood, I figured that at some point I would curse out the wrong person and they would put me out of my misery and I would end up face down in a ditch somewhere. And I was okay with that. Growing up, I really was okay with that because I didn't feel like my life had any value. I felt like I was a mistake. The night that I accepted Christ, I had been asking God, why me? Laying in bed at night, looking up at the ceiling, asking why me, and going to church on one random Wednesday night as part of a youth group. And, I just felt like God speaking to me that night and saying, hey, Tony, I'm here. You wondered why I'm here. Trying to understand what it was to be a Christian and given a Bible. And I said, okay, if this is God's instruction manual, if everything that I need to know to be a Christian is in this book, then I'm going to read this book cover to cover and I'm going to figure this out because I wanted to know what it was to be a Christian. So I literally started at the very beginning. I started with Genesis and I worked my way through the Bible, and I got to the book of John, and I got to the ninth chapter of John, and at the very beginning of the ninth chapter, there's a story where Jesus and his disciples, they're walking along a road, and they see a man that was born blind, and Jesus' disciples, they ask, Rabbi, why was this man born blind? Did he sin or did his parents sin? Because the disciples, they believed that if there was a disability involved, that there was somebody had done something wrong. And so they believed that sin was the reason why disability was there. And Jesus says to his disciples, no one sinned, not him, not his parents. This man was born blind so that the glory of God could be shown through his life. And in that moment, when I read those words for the first time, I felt like God was tapping me on my shoulder saying, Tony, you've wondered why your entire life, why you were born this way. This is why. I want to use your life. I want to use your story. I want to use the gifts that I've given you to bring my name glory. Not to bring Tony glory. I'm not going to make you rich and famous, but I want you and your story to point people back to me, and just understanding that for the first time, I realized that while the world sees my cerebral palsy as a disability, in that moment I came to realize that my cerebral palsy is my God-given ability to be able to impact this world in a positive way for His kingdom, and so like. For me, faith has always just been at the foundation of everything that I do, going forward. And for my wife, the biggest compliment that she gives me is that she says that I'm the one that brought her close to God when she was very far away from God. She said through my example, through my life, through the way that I've led her in our marriage, she says that I've brought her closer to God through my example and through the various conversations that we've had about God, about Scripture, about the Bible, and because she knows that she can bring me any question that she wants, and not that I know everything, because I don't, but I'll give her the best answer that I can. And if I need to do some further research, she knows that I'm happy to do that. And then we'll come back and we'll have a second conversation about it later on.
That's wonderful. And I'm curious to examine that concept of existing so as to spread the glory of God. For our listeners who may not be religious, I'm wondering, is the meaning of that sentiment that if a person has a struggle such as a disability, then it creates for them perhaps a motivation to want to spread God's word as a means of inspiring other people? Is that the sentiment behind that concept?
I don't know if necessarily everyone that has a disability, is going to have that same sort of calling. I know that I do for my own life, but what I can say is that everyone that is here, everyone that is born on purpose for a purpose. Now, I think that purpose is going to look different for each individual, and so sometimes if you have a disability, can you be inspirational? Can you use your story to point people to Christ? Yeah, I absolutely believe that you can do that, but I don't think it's necessarily a default. I believe that we all have certain gifts and certain talents, and those gifts and those talents are going to lend you to just doing whatever God has called you to do. Now, what I will say is that even if you're not called to be inspirational, the way that you lived your life and just the way that you carry yourself and the way that you move through life can still be glorifying to God because of the way that you carry yourself. If you have been in the disability environment and you've known many people that have lived with disabilities, then we know the full spectrum. There are people that are extremely joyful despite having a disability, and there are people that are extremely bitter, because they're living with the disability. And I think, those things, they have their place. But if you are bitter because of a disability, then that points to work that needs to be done to help you see that, what, this is not the end. This is not, your life still has meaning, and the disability is not going to define you. It's just a part of who you are. It's not your actual identity. It's just a part of who you are.
Absolutely. We can understand why people would be upset by their struggles, but there is hope to be found beyond them. And we've seen throughout history and to present day people who are plagued by a number of different challenges. Some people who are completely paralyzed and may not be able to speak even have made fantastic accomplishments in their chosen fields because they were in a position where they could say, even though I do have this disability, I don't have to let it define me and I can still try to make something of life. And then they succeed quite spectacularly. And there have been people who were healed who thought they might never be able to speak or walk again, who pushed through the rehabilitation process and were able to find success on the other side of that. So there's a lot to be said for that resilience. It's not easy to have by any means. I don't imagine it's easy to come to that point. And it's also not to deny that the struggles are real, but more that if you do try to push past it, then you have a far greater chance of finding happiness and something wholesome on the other side of that than if you don't. I'm wondering if there are some other stories that you might be able to tell either from the Bible or from your own experience that demonstrate some of the other purposes that a person born with a particular challenge or a disability might have in God's eyes, other than potentially using themselves as an inspiration to others.
With the character that you have, I think you can teach about patience. I think you can teach about, perseverance. I think you and I have both mentioned it. You can teach about resilience because it does, when you have a disability and you do push through, you're going to push through some hard things. No matter what the disability is, there are going to be some hard challenges that you're going to have to push through if you decide to push through those things. And I think that example is something that anybody can see and relate to, because even if it's not a disability, we're all going to face things that are going to be tough for whatever reason, whether it's a job loss or, trying to push through a promotion or whatever the case might be. Like there are, ways that you can look at, someone that is living with this disability and say, okay, I may not understand that faith, and I may not even agree with that faith, but I see how they are still pushing through life. And you know what? If they can push through life, so can I. And if they can get past the tough circumstances, so can I. And I think those things are things that we not, discount just because of whether or not we agree with a religious position or not. I know that from my own life. I heard a speaker one time say, you are best able to help the person you used to be. And that's kind of where the Unshaken podcast was kind of born, is my wife and I realized that we could help those that are just starting this journey, maybe a newlywed couple. And we work with other organizations like Johnny and Friends, who does a marriage retreat for couples where one or both have a disability, and we're able to share our story. We're able to share kind of our dating experience and make people laugh and all that kind of stuff, and be able to say, hey, we've been there. We've been in your shoes, and it does get better. You just have to communicate, and we're able kind of work through those things and work, sometimes there's anger, sometimes there's resentment, sometimes, maybe it's a couple that was very athletic. That's how they met, that's how they fell in love, through some activity, say skiing, for example. And now one or both of them, through some sort of tragic accident or whatever, is now disabled and now they can't do those things. And so how do you learn to still love each other even though this thing that was such a big piece of it is no longer a part of it? Being able to talk through those things and being able to say, you know what, this may not look exactly the same, but you can still enjoy so many activities despite the disability and still have a very fulfilling and very fruitful life, even if this piece is not a part of it anymore.
As a counsellor, I receive referrals from others, and I also like to help my audience become aware of resources and other providers which may be beneficial, as well as help other individuals and organisations gain exposure. That's why I host the Your Listener Partner Network, and I'd like to thank my partners for their support. I'd like to introduce the Southeastern Suicide Prevention Network. The Southeastern Suicide Prevention Network is a volunteer community group working across the southeast of Melbourne, Australia. The network's goals are to raise awareness of suicide, reduce stigma regarding it, and build resilience through education and community engagement. They operate community projects and events. These include a memorial service in December, speaking engagements, and their annual Spotlighting Bullying exhibition, which invites schools, artists, and local groups to explore themes of kindness, belonging, and emotional well-being through art. Contact them at sesuicideprevention@gmail.com. I understand. So, in effect, in the eyes of God, the disability itself is not the defining factor, but the disability is perhaps one of a number of different qualities that a person has, and when they're combined, they form a very specific and finely engineered individual who has certain purpose as a result of the qualities they have. The disability is just one quality, but they also have that combined with all the other qualities that that person has individually. And in combination, it creates their individual character, and the individual character then has a purpose on earth, and that could be any one of a number of purposes. It could be to inspire others, it could be to create, it could be to motivate, it could be any number of things. It could be to take care of, it could be all number of things.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, one of the gifts that my wife has is a gift of hospitality. She loves to be able to cook for others and to feed others and to just love on them if they've had a hard time, and she loves to be able to bring friends over and say, hey, I know that you've been just going through some tough times, and let me just feed you a meal that you don't even have to think about. You don't have to cook, you don't have to clean, you don't have to do anything. We're gonna do it for you, and we're just gonna love on you. We just want you to relax and just take the evening off, and we're just going to do it all for you. And she loves to be able to do that. She loves to be able to love on people that way by just, providing a meal and just providing, a space where they can just rest and they don't have to think about, all the things that are going on. They can just have an enjoyable meal and with some friends that love on them and then move forward, and then you figure out how to make it through the next day. And but hopefully with that night of rest, you get a little bit of a reset, so that you can then face tomorrow a little bit better, a little bit more resilient, because you got some rest instead of having to constantly chase and feel like you're in that mouse wheel of constant motion. But you actually got some rest where you can say, okay, now I can start over. Now I can hit the ground running with fresh eyes to be able to, hopefully move forward.
That's a beautiful sentiment. I'm curious to also know more about the metaphysical experience that you had when you first became closer to God, because I know for our non-religious listeners, it may be difficult for them to understand that. And I'm always curious to hear, what's it actually like within you when you first make a connection with God and when you pray with God? Can you describe it in terms, is it more a literal hearing, or is it more a spiritual feeling, or is it something else entirely? Is it something that can be described?
And you know what? I've always had a hard time describing it because it's not an audible voice. It's just something that I felt like within my heart. As far as like the first time that I truly, quote unquote, heard God, in my heart. It wasn't an audible thing. It was just something that I felt. It was something that like I was sitting inside of a youth group on what I consider a typical Wednesday night youth service, but I just felt a need to get up at the end of service. I got up, walked over to the youth pastor and said to him, like, I know that we just met, because we honestly had just met that day. That was the first day that I had walked into that church, never met him before. I had a couple friends that brought me there that night and was there just randomly on a whim. And honestly, I was there because I had a fight with my parents that morning, and I wanted to stay away from the house after school. So I said, "Hey, Mom, Dad, I'm going to church." And of course, Mom and Dad are not going to say, "No, you can't go to church." So it was, did I truly want to go to church for the spiritual experience? No, I was going to church to delay going back home. I was going to church to not have to spend more time with Mom and Dad. And, so going to the church, kind of met the youth pastor, but kind of sat in the back, didn't expect to, really pay attention or anything. But in those moments and listening to, what was going on and that night, the youth group actually put on a drama skit called The Christmas Box. And they said, at Christmas time, we get all these cool gifts, but the greatest gift that we can receive is salvation in Christ. And it was in that moment that, again, I just had this like warm feeling in my heart. And I just, without even thinking about it, I got up at the end of service, walked over to that youth pastor, and I said, "I know we just met. I know that you don't know me at all, but I need what they were talking about. I need Jesus." And he kind of looked at me like dumbfounded, like he didn't move or didn't speak for probably a good 90 seconds. And then, he finally kind of snapped out of it and was like, "Okay, hold on, stay right here. Don't move, don't go anywhere." And I sat down on a random chair. He went and got the couple of guys that had brought me that night. And we went over and he talked to me about what it was to accept Christ as my Lord and Savior. And, we talked through it and made sure that I understood, what I was asking for. And it was that night that I accepted Christ as my Lord and Savior. And then the following week, I was given a Bible, and that youth pastor actually picked me up every Wednesday from that point forward after school. And he said, "If you have questions as you read, ask me whatever you want." And so I did. I peppered him with questions week after week after week. It was probably hundreds of questions. Because I would just read chunks of the Bible, every week. I would just read, I was constantly reading. I took my Bible everywhere. I took it to school. I was reading at night before I went to sleep. I was reading in the morning when I woke up. I just was reading every chance that I got. And so I would just pepper him with questions. And it wasn't the easy questions. I gave him the easy ones and the hard ones. I just, anything that I didn't understand, I threw at him. And he told me later on, years later, that time where he spent with me was some of the most rich time that he's had in his own spiritual journey, because he knew that he had to be prepared for me. He knew that he needed to study and kind of brush up and understand where I was to answer those questions. I think, for me, like it's never been an audible voice. It's just been something that's always been on the inside from that first night. And I've just always felt like Jesus was a part of my heart ever since I said, yes, I want you to be my Lord and Savior.
That's a wonderful sentiment. And as I always do, I'd like to take this opportunity for our audience to reflect on the meaning of faith for people and how it actually intersects so effectively with our core operations and our core needs as human beings. And I often speak to this because there's a lot of division between people who believe that religion can't sit with science and people who believe that science can't sit with religion. And I've argued for a long time and will continue to that they actually sit beautifully with each other, even if an individual is not religious, because at our very core, throughout the entire of human civilization, one of our most basic needs is to have guidance, to be able to hold with certainty what we should do and what we shouldn't do, and what we can believe in, and something to motivate us to continue to try our best at life each day, regardless of how difficult things may get. And what we found is that regardless of the form that takes, whether it be in Christianity, whether it be in any other religion, or whether it be in other philosophies that people may follow, what is consistent between people is that we all need to have a conceptualization of why we are who we are and why we do what we do, and why we should continue to be resilient through the difficult times and continue living our lives the way we do, continue pursuing what we pursue. And religion throughout human development and throughout the development of civilization has provided us with that set of virtues. It's provided us with a purpose and a sense of meaning for who we are, a sense of meaning, a sense of purpose for us to continue doing what we do despite the challenges. And I think that even if we're not religious, there's much we can learn from it. And what we can learn most importantly is that regardless of what challenges we may experience, or regardless of the challenges that we may see in the world, or regardless of how hopeless life can seem sometime, there is always something to be gained if we believe in ourselves, and if we persist through the difficulties, and if we believe that there is something on the other side of it that is worth pursuing. And it's something that's far more wholesome than material. It's not money, it's not fame, it's not status, it's virtue in its purest form, virtue in terms of the relationships we have with other people, virtue in terms of the feeling of constructiveness that we have when we do good things for other people and when we create. The virtue of creating, the virtue of living a wholesome life, the virtue of having good relations with other people are things that can't be acquired materially. They're spiritual at their very basis, or they're metaphysical. The psychology of that, of having a sense of meaning and a set of principles by which we live our life, is so important, and evidently it's brought a lot of people out of the depths of darkness into living healthier, happier lives. And that's something that I would say people should all understand at its core, that the sense of meaning that we derive from the philosophy that we choose in life is pivotal to our existence, so much so that we can actually suffer if we don't have it. So it's important for us to all have that sense of meaning.
Religion and faith and science they're not enemies. They're companions. They're side by side, and I will always push back on anyone that says that they're competing against each other, because they're not. If I could put it in a way, I would say they're brothers. And so I don't believe that there's any competition between faith and science at all. What I do know is that fear is one of those things that will hold people back. But when we are able to push beyond the fear, the thing that we want most, and the thing that we're going to find most fulfilling in life, is directly on the other side of fear. If you had asked me, 3 years ago, would I be doing a podcast, I would have said, no, absolutely not. I would have said, you're insane. But going through this process and building a podcast and building a community and building the skills that are needed to do a podcast, you push through many walls of fear in order to get this done. And John, I know that you know exactly what that feels like in creating your own show. But I truly do believe, and really what I've come to understand is why so many inspirational speakers talk about pushing beyond fear. It's because they know, and I now understand of how much can come from life and through life when you are able to push past that fear. And John, I agree with you. It's not monetary. It's not anything like that. It is what you are actually building within the community that you're serving that is more valuable than any sort of material possession that we have. It's the impact that I see and the impact that my wife and I are able to have through the Unshaken podcast means more to us than anything that we would ever do from a monetization, aspect. And we don't monetize our podcast at all. It is just something that we wanted to do because we said we knew we had conversations that we thought, you know what, if we can put that out there, those conversations are going to be helpful for somebody. And if we can help just one person, it's worth it. And that's where we started. We said, hey, let's see if we can help just one person. And that's grown and multiplied as we've just been consistent in sharing from an honest perspective, sharing from honest stories, not perfect, not, glamorous, not pretty, but just honest, real human stories that we've experienced to be able to say, hey, we've gone through this. We're not perfect. We're far from perfect, in fact, but we've gone through this, and maybe this will help you. And if it does, great. And even if this exact situation isn't something that you can relate to, maybe there's a piece of it that you can take that does relate to something that you are going through. So hopefully through those things, we're able to just help anybody that would, listen to the podcast or read a blog or whatever other content that we decide to put out there. Everything that we do is about helping people. And if we do that, we've done our job.
Absolutely. It's a wonderful sentiment, and leaving a legacy of helping people and being able to give to others is something that is so wholesome. It's part of the virtue of life, really. And your exploration of fear is really important there, and there's a really important lesson to be learned because so much has happened in the course of humanity that could have been avoided but for fear, and we often are so unaware of the fact that it's fear that's motivating our actions, and many human created disasters have been precipitated by something as simple as fear. And people may discount it and say that it seems like an oversimplification, but it's only because we fear not just other people, but also experiences within ourselves. We fear anxiety, we fear uncertainty, we fear not knowing something when we think we should, and that can motivate us to take such drastic actions. And that's part of the reason why that some people argue that faith and science are at odds with each other, because there are some representatives of both who are actually scared of the other without realizing that they very much exist peacefully. And we could say quite plausibly that if we are creations of God, then so is science, because that's our way of then understanding the world that God's created for us.
Yeah, absolutely. I believe that God created science and that he gave us the intelligence to understand science, which then helps us understand the world that we live in and even understand him better because of the intelligence that he designed us with to be able to learn and grow and be able to understand more and more each and every day. I mean, go back 1,000 years and look at where we were then and where we are now. We got there because we learned. We got there because of intelligence, because of growth, because we have the capacity to learn and to understand more each and every day if we choose to do so. And I think that's the key of it, is that we have to be willing to say that we want to learn more, we want to grow, and if we are willing to learn, then we can understand a lot more. We just have to be willing to do it. And for some people, they're not willing to learn. For some people, they're not willing to challenge what is comfortable, but they just want to stay within, a small bubble that they've created for themselves. But I believe that a richer life is available for you if you're willing to say, no, I actually want to learn. I want to grow. I want to understand as much as possible. And I believe that the more that we learn, the richer life we'll have.
Well, Tony, this has been an inspirational conversation and I've really enjoyed it. Thank you so much for being a guest today.
Thank you so much again for having me. Look forward to many more conversations in the future, and I wish you all the success with your show.
Thank you, Tony, and likewise. And to our audience, thank you so much for joining us today. As per usual, if you have concerns about yourself or someone else, never take what you find on the internet or in the media as advice. Seek advice from a professional. You can find my details in the description of this episode if you're in Australia and seeking counselling, and Tony's website and links will also be in the description of this episode for those who wish to contact his ministry. And if you have any feedback on the program, be you someone who wants to be a guest or someone who has any other feedback, or you want to suggest a topic for discussion, please contact me. I always love to hear from the audience. And until next time, everyone, take care.